Good evening. Be turning, if you would, to Mark chapter 8. We'll be looking at a very small handful of verses tonight. This is another one of those small sections of reading about the miracles of Jesus. Mark chapter 8, simply verses 22 to 26. Your Bible may title it A Blind Man Healed at Bethsaida, and that's what we're going to title it here as well. But this is one of the rare ones that only shows up in one book in the Bible. So sometimes we can go to Matthew, or we can go to Luke, or you might be able to go to John, and you'll be able to find it. Not tonight. If you're not in Mark, you're going to be out of the loop on this. However, there are a few similarities. You may remember, I think last week we talked about the feeding of the 4,000. Remember that? And we had a little quiz at the end, and we said, what compared? How did the feeding of the 5,000 compare to the feeding of the 4,000? And there were some similarities. We talked about how that they took place in different parts of the world. Not parts of the world, but parts of the world that they were existing in at the time. But there was sort of a feeding of Jewish people, and then there was a feeding of Gentile people. Well, today, when we cover this lesson, I want you to think about, what does this miracle compare to that we've maybe talked about in the last few weeks? Okay? Is there anything in this miracle that seems kind of familiar to? And that's what we're going to talk about as we go this evening. This is our 23rd out of, I believe, 34 of these. So we are, I don't know, 2/3 of the way through, or 3/4 of the way, or something like that. But Jesus heals the blind man at Bethsaida. Let's talk a little bit about what this means, Bethsaida. Okay. So when we talk about this town, this is not the first time that we have mentioned Bethsaida. It is a city located just to the sort of north of the Sea of Galilee. We've been in and around the Sea of Galilee over and over again. Jesus sort of returns to this spot throughout his teaching, especially these miracles that are being performed. But this was the village of Bethsaida, and more specifically, it was called Bethsaida Julius, was located on the east side of the Jordan River, near its entrance into the Sea of Galilee. Of course, the Jordan River was a prominent river at the time period, but also the Sea of Galilee was a prominent location for fishing. And so you can imagine a city that sat at the edge of a river where it would empty into a lake or a sea was going to be fairly prominently populated. And it grows from a small village into a large city. Philip, and this is the governor, the son of Herod, built the village into a city, naming it Julius in honor of Julia, the daughter of Augustus. And so many towns were named after the Caesars, were named after prominent people there in Rome as well. They named it after her. Modern archaeologists, though, say that the city was then renamed in honor of Augustus's wife, Livia, known as Julia Augusta, after her adoption into a prominent Roman family. Now, none of that matters. But the point of me telling you that is to show you that sometimes place names change. And a lot of times they change depending on who's in charge. And some people, when they take over, they want things named after them. And sometimes they don't. And so these names will change over time. Why does that matter for Bible study? Well, I'll put that question to you. Why does the name of a location and a potential change of the name of a location matter in Bible study? Okay. That's that's true. That's true. And this is a good example here too of a Roman name. But many of these places, once they were no longer ruled by Rome, they changed into their language as well. There are French cities and there are English cities, and they may be the same city, but they're called different things by different people. Why else might it matter? Why else might the location of the name of a location matter in a Bible study? Okay.
Here we see this city is mentioned in Matthew, where it says, "Woe to you, Bethsaida, for if the worst was done, they would have repented." So we see that this city was a good city, not a good place.
Okay.
So it kind of gives us a little background.
Any others? I'm fishing a little bit. No pun intended for what the city was for. But if you see a city that's ruled by actions that took place in that city, if it's a group of people, if it's ruled by an emperor or a leader who's very violent, who was killing people, that could signal why certain things happen in that place. And so the way we look at this, the way we need to figure it, obviously all the things that we've said so far, it allows us to put it on a map. It allows us to recognize that name may change over time. It allows us, as Ben said, to sort of cross-reference and go back and look and see maybe a negative or a positive about that location as well. And so it gives us sort of an understanding of what was happening, because nothing happens sort of in a bubble, right? Your day-to-day life, you go from point A to point B to point C, but there are all sorts of other things happening around you, right? And how many of you have people that it seems like every time I go to Walmart, I see that person? How many of you have went to Walmart though and said, "I've not seen that man in 40 years? Why does that happen? Fate? And I guess that's what it is. But these things are sort of all happening. Well, if we understand what's happening in the world, it helps us to understand a bit why certain miracles maybe were performed, or why Jesus was in certain locations, maybe why they weren't in certain locations. So the point of that is for you. By the way, that picture is a carving, a sculpting of the woman that it's named after. So do you like her hair? The city is, the bottom picture is the ruins of the city. So it's not a man. Just because she has a bad haircut, you don't got to be critical of her. Somebody carved that. I don't know how people carve things like that either. Like, can you imagine everybody's hair would look like mine and Pat's if we carved these pictures out if I was the one who was carving it. Yes, ma'am. Absolutely. If you didn't hear Tom, he said the laws could change as well. And depending on one country being ruled by another, that could affect it as well. Bethsaida means house of fishing. It's speculated that there were actually multiple towns. Towns is probably not the right word, but locations near the Sea of Galilee that are referenced here. It was the home of Philip, Andrew, and Peter. That's why we read what we read this evening to point out where they were from. So it's a bit of a homecoming. I would imagine that when Jesus was performing these miracles, the people that were in the community knew Philip and Andrew and Peter, and so they had some sort of knowledge of them, might have trusted them or understood who they were a little bit, and might have gave Jesus maybe an opening to get into that community as well. Go ahead. So this is, generally speaking, the area of Bethsaida. And then it's a little hard to tell, but this is the Sea of Galilee back here. Yeah. 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 So most of the time, we use the word desert a little different than the Bible usually does. The Bible uses it in order to reference a place that was lacking in like food or something like that. A lot of lacking in vegetation as well. And also, with things, climate changes and things like that too, areas that can become more or less also. But that gives you an idea. I feel like I've shown a picture similar to that before. Yeah. Right.
So they kind of use desert the same as what we
wilderness. It's just kind of remote.
Well, I think we would use the word. How many of you have read books or seen stories where it's like they washed up on a desert island? That doesn't mean a sandy desert, but rather just a place where nothing was there. I think that's how that word is more often used there. There's your picture there, the man healing, or Christ healing the blind man, as you can see there. And we're going to talk about this evening. I want you to think about the method that's used whenever we talk about this. All right. So again, we're in Mark chapter 8. There's only a handful of verses. So the more questions you have, the more comments that you make, the better it is. Or if you really want to get ice cream after church, you just don't ask any questions. We'll be done in about 10 minutes. So depending on what you're looking for post church this evening. But Annette, do you care to read Mark chapter 8, verses 22 to 24? All right, so I'm going to stop there for just a second. Reality is that there's a couple more verses, and it kind of works better for it all to be piled together, but I need to break this down just a little bit. So I want you, don't say anything. Remember last week we practiced, just thinking. All right, I want you to think about what is the most eye-catching thing in these three verses to you. Raise your hand if you have an answer. I suspect that Ella probably just answered for everybody right then. If you didn't hear Ella, she said spitting on his hands, putting on his eyes. Will. Okay, well, if you might have had that one as well, but I feel like the spitting on the eye thing. Mel, you want to go back and look at the picture? He was poking him. This doesn't look very healing in this picture, but the reality is, when we talk about this healing, that's kind of what happens. So let's talk about a couple of questions here before we go into it. At the very start, Mark 8:22, what did the people beg Jesus to do? So they brought a blind man to him and begged him to touch him, the New King James Version says. So there is a level of faith here, right? There's a belief that if Jesus will touch him, that'll take care of it, right? That will heal him. Now, what does touch him mean to most of us? Okay, so if I were to say, touch that person and heal them, where would you probably touch them? Arm, shoulder, back, head. Okay, what was that, Mel? That kind of the old school, like in the 80s, the faith healer, knock them down. All right. I don't know any of us would have chosen the method that Jesus chose. But what was the initial method of healing used by Jesus in Mark chapter 8, verse 23? Let's go into that sentence, that verse, Mark 8:23. And let's just break down the entirety of the verse. The first part of the verse says, so he did what? Took him by the hand, so he's with him, and he leads him out of town. Now, why would you do it this way? Why take him by the hand? He's blind, right? He's blind, and so he's going to take him by the hand, leads him out of town. What would maybe be the reason for this? I'm sorry, Tom. Okay, so sort of removes that. Go ahead, Ben.
I think this is a town that had very little faith, like certain places you say you could not do miracles there because of their lack of faith.
Uh-huh.
And I think he's getting them away from all the naysayers, or maybe all the sin that was in that town, the corruption or whatever it is, he don't want to do this miracle in that town. He wants it done outside.
Very well could be. And again, that's all speculation there, but it certainly would you could fill in the blanks as to why it would be. But we're not done with verse 23. So he's taking him out of town, and then he does what? Now, the first two things have made sense, right? I'm going to walk you out of here. We're going to get away from the crowd, kind of calm it down a little bit. But how many of you feel like, well, when I asked you a minute ago, what would you touch to heal him? How many of you said, nobody, no, none of us said that, right? That feels like an odd thing. But I asked you a minute ago, I said, think about some other healings that Jesus has done and go back a couple of weeks. Do you remember the guy that couldn't hear? What did he do? What did Jesus do? He did. Kind of stuck his finger, I think about it like kind of, and we talked about it that night and we said, that seems like an odd thing to do, right? I mean, I get touching his ears, but we said it was almost like a cartoonish level or a comical thing. So keeping that in mind, Jesus spits in his eye and touches his eye right there. And then we're still in verse 23. What does Jesus ask him? He said, can you see anything? Okay. What does the man answer in Mark chapter 8 and verse 24 to Jesus' question? Hold on to that for a second. He looks up, and you're exactly right, Lucille. He says, I see men like trees walking. Ben, translate that for me. Kind of blurry, right? How many of you can see me well right now, but if you took your glasses off, I'd look a little different? Why is it that I would look a little different? Tom's acting it out. Tom, what do I look? How different do I look right now? What color shirt am I wearing? It's white. What color are my eyes? Can't tell. Okay. And so sometimes when we wake up in the middle of the night, we take our glasses off during the day. I know what I'm seeing, but I'm not seeing it super clear. That's kind of what we see with this guy right here. So my question for you is this: was this man healed at that time? Not completely, but he clearly could see better than what he had been able to see beforehand. That's true. That's true. It could be. Yes.
I think this way that's written there, I think you can spit on the hand.
Yeah.
Because we'll see that.
Sure.
Because it would be hard to spit it somebody's eye.
Right.
That would be an offensive thing to do. It says that. I know it says that, but I just have to see that Jesus put spit on his hands and rubbed his eyes. I don't know if anyone's capable of spitting.
Well, I don't know if it matters.
No, it is.
It just says spit on God's hands.
Let's
Well, it does matter to me though, because I would not want that spit in my eye.
If you were blind, you just won't be able to see.
That's true. I think that's a fair, and I think that's why I mentioned, I'm actually kind of glad that you mentioned this, because that's why I mentioned the other thing. When we talked about the guy being healed by, like that, it seems that's not the way. I remember asking you all that question a few weeks ago. Is that how you would have done it? And all of you said no. Is this maybe how you would? I don't know how it was done, but it clearly was not done in a way that most of us would. Most of us would have probably done something like that to their eyes, or we might have snapped our fingers. But this is something, it may have seemed offensive, and you may be offended by it, but the offense worked. And that might be a point to show it as well. Go ahead, Lucille. Now, we're going to come back to that one here in just a second. Let's go ahead and read then Mark 8, 25 and 26. That's what Lucille, go ahead and read that since you were referencing it just a second ago. Okay, so then let's consider this. So in Mark chapter 8, verse 24, Jesus asked him, in a sense, what do you see? And he said, I see men like trees walking. Ben said, in our language, he said, I see something, but it's blurry. That's the way we would sort of describe it. So Jesus then has a follow-up sort of treatment here. Lucille just read. What's the follow-up? What does Jesus then do as a follow-up in verse 25? put his hands on him again. Okay. Now, what was the result of this? And he was restored and saw everyone clearly. So I have two questions for you. Question one: did the first effort fail? Okay. So you know when you're at the eye doctor and they do that thing and they say, is it better or worse? You know, and you say better, you say worse, and they pop the button, you know, they move it up or move it down or whatever. So we don't think that it failed. Did it work the first time? Okay. So in a practical sense, it worked some because it took him from not being able to see to being able to blur. Melvina, say your answer. Okay. Ben, you were going to say something a minute ago and I overstepped you.
That too, what she's saying, I think it was the man's faith was getting in the way a little bit, maybe. That's what he expected to see was the first thing, but I also think too, that here, like many of the things in the Bible, it's kind of painting a picture. When a person becomes a Christian, you know, you don't see everything right away. You get it a few of the answers, but you don't see everything right away. And then as you mature, you can see more clearly. And when you're in the presence of Jesus, we see it most clear as it's going to be. And I think that's kind of a hidden lesson in here.
Could very well be the case in that. Now, go ahead, Josh.
Is this the first miracle we've studied that when he healed somebody that wasn't innocent, that it had to do a part two, I guess you could say?
The closest thing that I can think to this is when he would say, when you go home, that person will be healed. And that at least gave some wiggle room there to get from here to my house. And I don't know if that, you know, when did it happen? I don't know. But the point, but yes, for me, this is the only time we've seen a. Yeah. I can't remember. Right. Right. That's you may be right. I'm can't remember. I'm sorry. Can you come up and slap me in the head like you did Ben just a minute ago, and maybe it'll come to me right there. Now, I will say this though. We've referenced a few times that there were more miracles of Jesus than what we see. And so who knows? That adds a second part to this that we don't really know, because I don't know how they necessarily would have been performed. Yeah.
This doesn't have anything to do with anything, but every time I've ever been scratched or cracked or cut, I lick my finger and I rub it.
Yeah.
Okay. And I don't know that it helps it, but it lets you see the wound a little bit better, you know.
Yeah.
You know. And I remember my mother taking her spit and wiping dirt off me or whatever.
Right.
I'm going into church and wiping dirt off. Did you guys have gone through that?
How many of y'all were embarrassed when your mom did that? Like, get off me.
It's an improvement.
Right. Okay.
The scratch or the cut or the bruise or whatever.
All right. I forgot to click forward here because we did sort of answer. We did answer this question there just a second ago. Let's think about one more.
That's why I say with this last question, when he says he put his hands on him the second time. The way Mark writes, Mark hits the high points.
Right.
And I think God allows Mark to write the way he did. The Holy Spirit allowed him to write the way he did. Mark leaves out a lot of stuff. In this instance, he's the only one that says it. And I think when it says that he put his hands on him the second time, that implies completely that he put his hands on him the first time. He put the spit on his finger and he rubbed it on his eyes, rather than just spit in his eyes. That's my contention has been my whole life.
It says that I don't think there's any debate that he put his hands on him the first time. No, it does. It says he spit on his eyes and put his hands on him in Mark 5 or Mark 8:23. And then again, I don't know why we're debating this, but I think it's, yeah. Sure. Yeah. And I think your reference point to walking into church with your mom and she's doing that kind of thing, I think we can all understand that's a method of like a sort of quick cleansing that might have, not for you, but not, right. Sure. Sure.
In certain ways, Jesus went about doing things we've seen has been odd to us.
Right. Right. Well, that was my contention with the ear thing, was that we've got a little bit of evidence of sort of, I wouldn't have done it that way sort of thing. Very well. Sure. This is Mark 7:31 through 37. We read this the other day, but this was the story of Jesus healing the deaf and the mute man. As you can see there, Mark 7, starting with verse 31. Again, departing from the region of Tyre and Sidon, he came through the midst of the region of Decapolis to the Sea of Galilee. Then they brought to him one who was deaf and had an impediment in his speech, and they begged him to put his hand on him. And he took him aside from the multitude, and he put his fingers, and he spat and touched his tongue. Then, looking up to heaven, he sighed and said to him, Ephphatha, that is, be open. Immediately his ears were opened, and the impediment of his tongue was loosened, and he spoke plainly. Then he commanded them that they should tell no one, but the more he commanded them, the more widely they proclaimed it. And they were astonished beyond measure, saying, he has done all things well. He makes both the deaf to hear and mute to speak. So my question is based on what we read tonight in Mark 8 and what we read a couple weeks ago in Mark 7. What are the similarities and the differences between the two? Okay, we see that. So there's a similarity. Tom first. Not to tell anybody. Jimmy took that one as well. What other similarities do we see? Hands on him, okay? Ear to eye. Took him aside from the multitude, Will. Definitely so. What about differences? Mm-hmm. Yeah, this is. I think that's the biggest difference here, is that we see once versus twice. And so I wanted to hit on these both here because they have some similarities to me. They're last week we talked about the feeding of the 5,000 and 4,000, and those were very almost carbon copies of each other in sort of the method. This similar but different because you're trying to heal something different. What we don't know is all of the miracles that Jesus performed. I mentioned that a minute ago. But I don't know that there might have been somebody with a broken arm who was healed. How would you have done that? Somebody with a broken foot. How would you have done that? Could they walk away immediately? We see Jesus heal people that were paralyzed or that were lame, that couldn't walk. There's so many sort of options and ways of thinking about it. If you'll remember, this is the 23rd lesson. So let's say 25 weeks ago, probably 26 weeks ago, I said to you, and we started this class, I said, if we're not careful, we can sort of bog down in the sort of how did this happen? We can get sort of overwhelmed in that there's no way if you touch his ears, he can hear, or if you spit and touch his eyes, he can. If we're not, that's not the point of it. And Mary mentioned that a minute ago. She's talking about it's not the how, but it's the why. What was the goal of this? And so I asked, what was the goal of this healing of this man by Jesus? Show who he was. Say it again, the second part. Show who he was and what his abilities were. And then I heard it over here. Somebody said something. Oh, I'm sorry, was it? And then just the practical, this man who couldn't see now could. Ben.
First thing you see Jesus do is get him away from sin. Get him
Uh-huh.
away from the bad. Don't go back there no more.
Right.
Don't go back to these people, don't tell them, just stay away from the sin, stay near me, or stay, word of God.
Last question for you. What were Jesus's instructions to the man after healing him? I feel like I've written this question. It's the 23rd lesson. I feel like I've written this probably 16 times, I'd say, right? What was Jesus, in verse 26, Jesus's instructions to the man after healing him? Okay. So he said, don't go into town, and also don't tell anybody in the town. This is, yeah, he said, go to your house. He's basically saying, don't go that way, go this way, is what we see. Will. Now, verse 27. Does verse 27 have anything to do with verse 26? Your Bible probably has a new paragraph started. Here's why I ask it. This might be the first time that Jesus said, don't go and tell, that they didn't just immediately run and tell, right? I'm sure they probably did, but at least it wasn't mentioned right here. Most of the time, what does verse 27 usually say whenever we ask this question? They went straight and told everybody, made a neon billboard and made a big sign to tell it. Normally, when we see that, it says they told them not to tell. This one, we don't really see it, at least not immediately right there. But I'll ask the follow-up to it again. Why might Jesus be giving that man these instructions?
Well, maybe we're going back in there to the third town. Little faith, you don't want that man's faith.
Be challenged and pulled back down. Yeah. Why else might he have said it? Sure. Sure.
Because he's been blind now. He doesn't even really have to tell it.
We're gonna know it's up to something because they see Jesus taking him out of town, which is why you could also say 27 could tie into it.
Sure.
Because people know that they see Jesus take him out, and so Jesus goes back to his apostles and says, "So what are they saying about me?"
Right. Right.
Well, we never see who the they is. They could have been apostles that brought this blind man to Jesus.
Right.
We don't know that it was the town. It could have been the apostles ran across this man for some reason brought him to Jesus.
Entirely possible as well. Let's.
That's true, but also don't you think some of the Jewish leaders who was out following to see what it is, maybe Jesus is wanting to know what they're saying about him too, just,
So I think we're at the point where we've discussed this enough that we've got multiple answers that can practically and make sense that they would be possible answers. There's people that are clearly wowed by Jesus. There are people that are clearly wanting to use Jesus, and there are people who are wanting to put Jesus away so that none of this will happen anymore. 3 things to go home with. Number 1, Jesus doesn't always work the same way. And I don't think our miracle lesson would be good if every single miracle was Jesus, touching the person on the forehead. You have a broken leg, touch on the forehead. You have a demon possessed, touch on the forehead. He doesn't always work the same way. Were you about to say something, Mary? Right. Absolutely. And so we see Jesus heal this man in a certain way, but we're 23 lessons in, and we've seen a lot of different ways of healing as well. And to take what Mary was saying, what Jesus does for me might not be the same as what Jesus does for you, but that's okay because my needs are not the same as your needs, right? I have issues that you don't, and vice versa.
you both have the same problem, we both have alcoholics. Maybe what he helps you with might not be the same way he helps you.
Sure. I mean, it's the same sort of practical way that we would help. I mean, it's the same thing we talked about. Dad and I've talked about this before. Like, Is it important for the preacher to talk about baptism? Every Sunday. Every 30 minutes every Sunday, only lesson. It's not practical, right? It doesn't make sense because that's not what everybody needs all the time. Some people might need it now. Some people might need a refresher course on it. But if your preacher gives the same sermon every Sunday, you're not meeting the needs of all the people. It's the same thing there. Number two, and Ben kind of jumped on this a little bit, but we must learn to see Jesus more clearly, right? And so our faith should grow as we see that power. And so when Jesus is first with the guy, he says, I see men as if trees moving. I'm seeing it, but maybe not. But for us, it's the same way, right? We sort of are introduced to it, but the more we see of Jesus, what should our vision be? It should become more clear of what we're looking for. So as always, a shout out to Ben. He always has one of my talking points narrowed down as well. One of these days, I'm just going to leave it blank and we'll say, write that in, Ben. We'll see what happens. Number three, and we've mentioned this a time or two before, but God isn't forced to act according to our expectations. But we do that, right? We sometimes we want God to do it sort of the way that we think it should be. And we've talked a little bit about that here this evening. But we have to believe and worship him, right? And whether that results in a miraculous thing for us, how we would use the word miraculous, or if it simply gives us sort of the ability to sort of power through, well, that's what we're given, Mary. Right. 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 So I want you to think about your prayers. How many of you have ever prayed for something and the response came quickly? That's pretty cool, right? You feel good about that. We were talking with Michaela the other night, and she was telling us a story about when she was waiting on her test results, and she said she just got the girl that she was with and said, "We're just going to pray right now." You know, sometimes that's what we need, right? I thank you for sharing that. Everything you tell me is, I'm just kidding. But sometimes the answers can come quickly, right? But sometimes they go through stages, right? Sometimes the answer to our prayer is sort of a gradual, sort of slow process. Well, think about this man tonight. Did he see everything immediately? But he was on the right track, right? He was seeing things because he saw something he hadn't seen before, but it got even better. And sometimes with our prayers, it has to be that same way, that it might not be an immediate. But our expectation is, I pray, and God does what? Fixes it. But fixes it how? Right then, in what way? The way I wanted it, okay? What if it helps me but hurts Josh? Too bad. I got what I wanted, right? That's what our expectations can sometimes be, but that's not the way God works. And sometimes we're forced to work and sort of exist within the parameters of, you know, something that maybe didn't turn out the way we wanted. But that's a challenge for us to be able to power through it. Yeah. Yeah. But we only see there's only one answer to the prayer in our opinion, but it's not the same. Yeah, absolutely. Uh-huh. Right. So Dad followed in Ben's footsteps there. Took that last sentence that I'd written down. That was the solution may not come till our life is over, but his grace is sufficient. Go ahead, Ben.
Family member very, very bad alcoholic. And what any way to do with this church would always pray for it, pray for it, pray for it. Well, you know, you think, okay, well, God's gonna fix it, but he got diabetes. Because he got diabetes real bad, he had to quit drinking. After he quit drinking, then he was getting a little more open to the church, and it was steps. So
Right.
prayers got answered.
Right.
But it wasn't what, you know, any of us would have ever imagined.
Right.
The way it would have got.
And you probably you weren't praying that that person would get diabetes. Like nobody's going to pray for that. But there was an impetus to turn it to something else. And that, again, that hits on our last thing there. God's not forced to act according to our expectations. Any other thoughts from anybody before we go? Well, thank you. We got a lot out of 5 verses here this evening. Thank you all very much.